It was in the 13th century when the Bishop of Ossory in the medieval Kingdom of Ireland declared that his district was riddled with sinners, defilers, and worst of all, the worshippers of the devil. So when Alice Kyteler was accused of witchcraft by her stepchildren no less, she quickly attracted the judgmental attention of the Irish Church. But unlike most witch trials we're used to hearing about, where a woman was accused and subsequently investigated, usually biasly, Alice Kyteler was a wealthy woman and had friends in high places. To accuse a woman of her status of witchcraft was not so easily done. In fact, in Ireland, she would be one of the first women to be accused of such a thing in the first place. Interestingly enough, Alice Kyteler is also one of the first women to be accused in a witchcraft trial for having acquired her powers through sexual intercourse with the devil, or one of the devil's spawn. Such accusations would become common in the witch trials in later centuries. The Kyteler family were a family of Flemish merchants who had settled in Kilkenny sometime during the 13th century. Alice herself would marry William Outlaw, a wealthy merchant and moneylender, by whom she had a son also named William. Her husband, though, would fall ill and die, and it would eventually lead Alice to be remarried again to Adam Leblanc, another wealthy moneylender. Together, these two would amass a lot of money, and it would generate local resentment, some of whom were convinced that both Alice and Adam had murdered her previous husband William. Despite having children of his own, Adam Leblanc would actually leave all of his money, goods and jewels to Alice's son William, which, as you can imagine, boiled the blood of his actual biological children, who essentially received nothing. It doesn't seem to ever have been noted as to why Adam Leblanc would commit all of his possessions to William upon his death. Perhaps the young man had some profound impact on Leblanc, that he would view him as more of his own child than his other children. Or maybe, just maybe, there was some form of witchcraft at play, where some sort of spell was placed on Leblanc, causing him to deny his own children of his inheritance and place it into the hands of Alice and her son. It was a sentiment certainly shared amongst Leblanc's children, and it wouldn't make matters any better for Alice, who remarried a third time to a man named Richard de Vale, a wealthy landowner. Now, Richard also had a son, also named Richard, who by all accounts was said to inherit his father's wealth, but some accounts state that de Vale would also end up leaving a significant share to Alice's son William. Either William had some sort of charm about him that he was able to worm his way into the wills of his mother's husbands, or maybe, again, there was some form of insidious magic at work. However, unlike the second husband, Adam Leblanc, Richard de Vale actually did leave his son a share of his estate, though that too was eventually swiped by Alice, upon suing him for withholding it from her as a widow. At this point in time in Irish and English law, the concept of witchcraft was not necessarily considered malevolent. It was usually associated with magic, and magic had always existed as far as the general consensus went at the time. Medicines and other herbal concoctions were said to have been common practice, and those who made them either maintained a status as a good witch, or just someone who was more in tune with remedial practices. But soon, witchcraft would become to be seen as an inversion of Christianity, or at least some form of discrete opposition in which heresy was practiced. Witches became associated with the worship of the devil, and with dark rituals, those that would eventually become punishable by death. The complaints of Alice's stepchildren would reach the ears of Richard Ledrede, the Bishop of Ossory, the sort of man who was obsessed with God and would not tolerate any essence of blasphemy. He was militant in defending the integrity of the church and would uphold its authority and presence at all costs. Since his ascension to the role of bishop, it's understood that Ledrede showed a certain zealousness for people adhering to the church law. Some accounts note that Ledrede was on the paranoid side, in that he believed that his life was in danger of sorcerers and the dark magic that was slowly corrupting his district. So you can imagine when the complaints of Alice being a witch came to his attention, he lapped it up and set out to persecute the so-called witch with all the alacrity he could muster. There appear to have been 7 charges that were raised against Alice and her associates, including the apparent denying of Christ and the church. They were said to cut up living animals and would scatter their innards at crossroads as offerings to a demon known as the Son of Art. They were said to steal the keys of the church and would hold midnight clandestine encounters involving the skull of a robber. This skull was apparently used to house the intestines of roosters and chickens, as well as nails that had been clipped from dead bodies, hairs that had been plucked from the buttocks, and in one case, the clothing from a boy who died before being baptized. These horrid ingredients would make for potions, some of which were said to be instrumental in causing people to fall in love, or hate, or even possess people to attack and kill others. There is another tale that Alice herself would submit to an incubus by whom she would become most familiar with. Other tales state that she was in league with a demon that could turn into a cat or a shaggy black dog. Other accounts that report the demon in which she made her acquaintance was a black man from whom casted spells or taught her to cast spells that would see to the death of her husbands and the inheriting of all of their estates so that she and her son might live contently. Interestingly enough, Alice's fourth and final husband, known as John Poa, actually suspected that he was being poisoned towards the end of his life. He reported this to his family, where an account was made that Poa had actually lost his fingernails, his body hair was falling off, and he took on a very ill-looking appearance. It would lend credence to the accusations that Alice would soon sustain. The Bishop Richard Ledrede would take the case of Alice Kyteler very seriously. Some might say he even became obsessed with the accusing and trialing of her as a witch. He would write to the King's Chancellor in Ireland, a man in a highly ranked position with enough power to condemn Alice and ensure her arrest. But the King's Chancellor, known as Roger Outlaw, the brother or close relative of William Outlaw, who was Alice's first husband, was said to have a soft spot for her, and thus, he didn't take Richard Ledrede's claims seriously. Ledrede would continue to pursue Alice, going on to even summon her before him, but the Chancellor would often put up obstacles to prevent this from happening. In one instance, he even sent Alice away to Dublin. The Chancellor would go on to make several legal loopholes, such as the fact that he could not issue a warrant for Alice's arrest because a public prosecution hadn't been held, or that accused witches needed to be excommunicated first, or that 40 days hadn't elapsed, or that it was raining outside. He would use anything he could to stall Ledrede from completing his mission against Alice. Being tenacious though, Ledrede would follow every legal proceeding that the Chancellor threw in front of him to the very last detail. Ledrede also realised that while he could not obtain Alice so easily, he was able to get her son William, with whom he charged with heresy and harbouring a heretic. But Alice, or the King's Chancellor, was able to uproot Ledrede's plans by accusing him of defamation of character and forcing him into prison for 17 days. Incidentally, this would cause him to miss the day in which William was in court, so Ledrede could not be present to give his testimony. While in prison, Ledrede would ensure that his district was denied of baptisms, marriages, or even burials until he'd been freed. This might not necessarily seem like that great of a deal, but in those days, when the existence of hell and the devil was quite prominent, the vacancy of a bishop would have left people feeling vulnerable. After his release from prison, Ledrede's obsession with persecuting Alice and her son did not resolve. He once again insisted that they appear before him. A series of requests and avoidances were made by Ledrede and Alice respectively, but it would seem that Ledrede's words and the influence of the church would slowly begin to sway the public opinion against her. Sensing this, she fled from Ireland and was never seen or heard from again. It's possible she fled to England, but there are no records of this. Alice's son William Outlaw would not escape Ledrede though. For whatever reason, he remained in Ireland and was eventually imprisoned on the orders of Ledrede, who now received official support from the Pope in doing so. William would go on to confess to his crimes of harbouring his mother and her friends, all of which had now been accused of witchcraft and sorcery, and would be forced to bend the knee before the bishop. But Ledrede would be forced by the influential friends of Alice to free William and sentence him with a much smaller punishment, where he'd have to attend 3 masses every day for 1 year. He would also have to give food to the poor and undertake a project to cover the roof of St. Canice's Cathedral with lead. But when William failed to carry out this penance, he was thrown in prison again. An infamous account from all the drama that took place during this time is where Alice's maidservant Petronella was burned at the stake. She would be taken into custody shortly after Alice's disappearance and severely whipped under the orders of Ledrede. She would be tortured until she eventually confessed that Alice was a witch and that her friends were sorcerers. Naturally, it's likely she'd given in to the pain and wanted to put an end to it, and so made a false confession about her former mistress. But as I mentioned, Petronella would be burned at the stake after her confession as punishment for heresy and assisting of sorcery. To this day, it is unknown as to why she was singled out alone to obtain this confession, but it can be assumed that given how low her status was, Ledrede believed she was easy to break, and that when she did, the public would find it easily feasible that a servant was certainly capable of supporting sorcery. Petronella's account is nonetheless compelling in that she conceived such an ambitious and somewhat vile telling of Alice's witchery. She would claim that Alice would meet a demon named Robber, or the Son of Art, as he was known, who came from the depths of the underworld. As I mentioned earlier, she'd cut out the intestines of roosters and other small animals, and as Petronella's account goes, she would mix these with dead spiders, worms, and other insects. She would add a herb called milfoil, and then boil the mixture into a broth, which was served to achieve an unspecified effect. Petronella went on to confirm that she herself had consulted with demons under Alice's request, and that she had served as a medium between Alice and the demon Robert. She also claimed to have watched over Alice and the demon as they had sex. Some scholars argue that Petronella was actually suffering from ergot poisoning, which was prevalent at the time, which could cause the sufferer to have fever-intense dreams, similar to that of trips from LSD. They essentially believe that Petronella had suffered from hallucinations, and that this is the reason her account of Alice's witchery is so vivid. However, I think it far more simpler to believe that Petronella came up with the story so as to put an end to the torture which she had sustained. Of course, there is always the possibility that everything Petronella had said was true, and that she had seen the things in which she had described. William Outlaw would eventually succumb to Ledrede, and by one account would lie prone in the dirt before Ledrede so as to concede to him entirely. As a result, he was released from prison, but his penance was increased, so that he now had to cover an even larger portion of the cathedral roof with lead. Rather amusingly, and perhaps a sign of karma against Ledrede, the cathedral of the roof which William Outlaw covered would cave in as a result of too much lead being used. But what happened to Alice Kyteler? Do you think that she used her supposed magic to escape Ledrede? Or was she simply smart enough to realise that the public had turned against her, and that she too would be burned if she didn't flee? Do you think that Petronella's account of her witchery is true? Or was she forced to make the story up so as to put an end to her torture? Perhaps you think that Alice was indeed poisoning all of her husbands, considering that she had managed to outlive 4 of them. Or maybe, just maybe, she was a witch after all. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Until the next time, guys.